Hi, this is Paul Casey, the Kenpo Karate Hall of Fame, educational video series where we discuss principles of Kenpo, discussions of Mr. Parker's writings. Sometimes we go outside of the system and we look at influences that Kenpo had on other martial artists, and sometimes we bring them as special guests. But we always like to focus more importantly on the people that are very special to the American Kenpo system, and more importantly to the Kenpo Karate Hall of Fame. Today, we have two members from the Kenpo Karate Hall of Fame, a very exclusive group of individuals that are chosen by their peers, not because of a board, not because of their friendship. A lot of the people that actually are inducted are chosen because the person nominated them respected them. They might have been adversaries out on a mat or in a tournament, but they grew to really appreciate that person's talent. So in our second part, we are very honored to have with us Senior Master of the Arts, Lee Wedlake. Hello, Lee. It's good to see you. Good to see you. Great smile. How's Texas today?
Texas is overcast, but it's warming up. So we're good. Texas is always good.
Good, good. And then we also have a Hall of Fame member, a Senior Master of the Arts, Dennis Conatser Sr. Hello, Dennis.
Good morning. Good morning.
It's good to have you guys. Actually known each other a long time, probably longer than I have known both of you. I would hope. I mean, that was 1978. So yeah. You guys were around a lot longer than that. Blazing the Kenpo path. Destruction, like what's his name did to Atlanta, burning it all the way up.
Oh yeah, General Sherman.
However that works. So we're going to discuss some strengths that I really like. Mr. Wedlake, which I'll refer to Lee, and Mr. Conatser, I'll references Dennis throughout the discussion today. Mr. Lee Wedlake is an author, and that is really important in the American Kenpo system because Ed Parker believed in the thinking man. He wanted our martial arts to not only train, but also to be able to think and create. And these two men embodied that through their teachings, through their accomplishments, and in this case, Mr. Wedlake's writings. And he has written many books. He has a complete series on Kenpo forms and also basics. And I'm going to reference those today. We'll be looking at that. But before we go further, one of the books that Mr. Wedlake is involved in was The Infinite Insights. And that is what we'll be discussing today. And we're going beyond that. So the discussion is called Beyond Infinite Insights. And the first thing we have in here is that Mr. Parker wrote the dedication. Sometimes he had other people do the dedication, but he wrote this one. And I think this embodies Mr. Parker's thinking. He said, to all the readers of my 5-volume series of Infinite Insights into Kenpo, who with an open mind have taken on the challenge to examine, investigate, explore, expand, and expound on the principles and concepts offered therein, I dedicate this book. And the beauty of it is these two gentlemen were involved with this book. And during either the writing of it or the organization of it. And I know that Lee has great impact in that as well. And that's the first thing we got in there out of that book. So the Infinite Insights, and we're going to ask you to talk about that today, Lee. The other things that are really cool is that I have these other books that are very important, but we'll get to those later. I'll bring them up. So let's talk about Beyond Infinite Insights. Lee, how was it to participate in Volume 5?
The whole process was very interesting. And one of the stories I like to relate was that when I was out in California training, Mr. Parker gave me a manila folder with the rough draft to Volume 2 of the Infinite Insights books. And he hands it to me and he says, take this back to your room, to your hotel room, and read it over and bring it back and we'll talk. So I stayed up almost all night looking through this thing. And I was just like, oh my God, the information that's in here, just incredible stuff, things that I had not thought of, which was a constant in my training with Ed Parker. And I'm sure that Dennis would confirm that, because it was always just, oh man, didn't think of that. So I bring the document back and hand it back to him. And he says, "Well, did you make any corrections?" I said, "Corrections? No, but let me ask you about this." And it was pretty cool to sit there and talk with him about it, because he said, and I said, "Well, you know, if we did this," and I brought up the idea that, you know, being a South Side of Chicago street fighter, I'd seen guys do some pretty interesting things out there. And one of them was that a guy had put his hands on the hood of a car and kind of vaulted off and kicked. And I said, "Well, you know, so there's vaulting," and it says, and that we do that in the staff set. And he said, and he got excited. He says, "You know, if you vault, you can hurdle, and you can do this and you can do that." And that, when volume 2 came out in the foot and body maneuver section, those were included. And he said, "Well, this is what he does. Is I would talk with you guys. I talk with the guys, and each one's got a different comment, an aspect, an observation." And he said that Infinite Insights was supposed to be one volume, one single book. He said, "As I talk with you," meaning all of you guys, he said, "the book becomes more pregnant with information." I thought that was an interesting term also.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. 9 years after Mr. Parker's passing, which would be, let's see, that was 81 when the book, 82 when it came out, and then subsequently.
Mhm.
You write in your book, Kenpo Karate 101, which, by the way, collectively, all these books that I'll reference to today are now in a book that you have put together. Will you want to show that real quick before we go any further?
Well, actually, 201 through 601 were combined into this book, the Kenpo Karate Compendium, published
Okay.
by Blue Snake Books. So you can get this on Amazon, or you can go get it through Blue Snake's website.
I think that's important, folks, that you reference this, because listen to the conversation and go back and look at the readings. And if you have any further questions, you can probably reach out to Mr. Wedlake. But here in his book, 9 years after Mr. Parker's passing, Lee Wedlake says in his book, Kenpo Karate 101, "If there is one lesson I have learned through all of this, it is that anything is possible." Lee Wedlake, December 1999. So, oh boy, that. Here's even better. And I said this to both these gentlemen earlier today. Mr. Parker was well respected in his writings and such. And as you heard, Lee mentioned that he included some of the ideas that he had passed. And in Lee's book, it says in the preface to Lee Wedlake's book, Mr. Parker writes, and he says this: "It has always been my policy to allow my students freedom to expand and expound not only on the principles they have been taught, but those thoroughly learned and understood." He goes on further to say, "I'm proud to say that Lee Wedlake is a rare student who has studied with me diligently and has been able to meet obstacle and roadblocks with renewed vigor. Fondly," he says, "I highly recommend this book and feel that it is too should be added to your library of martial arts." So those are words directly from Mr. Parker. And in your case, he is speaking from a past before this was printed.
Right.
And which is very cool. So, I mean, look at what you just said, and then look what, it's amazing. We need to be following that, folks, and understanding what it is. I think you go on further to say you have to set goals. That was one of the principles that you're talking about here. Know what you want, have a plan, have a successful coach, take constant action, review your progress, and renew your goals. I think those are important factors that a great martial artist should learn from his teachers. What are your thoughts, Dennis?
But I agree with Lee. When I was in the office once, he handed me this file, and it was about this thick. And it was one of those expandable folders. And it was the total book, the first book that he was going to do, which was going to be one book. And, subsequently turned into 5. you know, as it was. And like Lee said, he had an interesting way with words. He said, "Oh yeah, the book kind of grew," and instead of just said it grew, and I enlarged it. He had to use a poetic word. You know, it got pregnant, and so with information. But that was Ed Parker, not just in our era, but you know, I think in his entire life, and particularly from '56 on. Depending on who was in his ear at the time, uh, he drew from everybody. He was a sponge, just like we are. You know, I think that's what he recognized in students like that. I think he recognized some of himself in us. You know, those that were inquisitive and were interested in digging. I brought a shovel once to a lesson. He goes, "What do you think I got that for?" "Well, because I'm going to be digging." And he started laughing. And you know, and so just don't bring that again. You don't need that. And so it was kind of funny, you know. But the thing is, you know, as he talked to people, and like Lee said, you know, he started asking them some questions, and you know, all of a sudden, one thing pops into another. Somebody brings up a perspective or an idea or something, and sometimes it takes root, and you know, it grows from there. And in some cases, that root in the past had actually become a book. You know, and so it just is amazing. One of the earliest ones was the book on karate. What is it? Karate blows implements. What is
Medical
it?
implications
Med-
of karate.
Medical implications of karate blows.
Right.
And that was a thesis, you know, that
Mhm.
turned into a book. And that's not the first one. There's been others that have done the same. And it was a very interesting book. That gentleman still lives. He lives in San Diego, which was who was it, Lee?
Brian
Brian
Adams.
Brian Adams. Yeah, I knew it was Brian. I couldn't remember his last name. And so he now teaches some other martial art, but it was a very interesting book, which said the thing that I got out of that particular book was the timing that he had. He said, look, to do an inward elbow to somebody's jaw, it takes about 3/10 of a second. And I'm kind of going, when I first read this, you know, I'm like an orange belt or something when I first got this book. And I thought, man, 3/10 of a second. Whoa. You know, it's longer than I take to breathe. And so it was very interesting how that goes in. And through history, I can almost tell you where he got this from and that from and that from and who he got that from. You know, it was real interesting. I mean, Lee and I came up in a period where Lee and I, you know, our relationship goes back to the early to mid '80s. You know, somewhere right in there. And so that's been what, almost 40 years,
That's
you know,
correct.
approximately. So, you know, we've had a lot of interesting discussions with and without Ed Parker, you know, through that. But the art is like Mr. Parker said, and more I'm understanding where he's at. The more I think about it, the more I see now is there's more that can be done. There's more that isn't talked about. There's more that could be talked about. There's more that's needed. And there's some things that were old roots like respect that needs to be reviewed and renewed because it's not very strong today, or it's weakening as it seems. And it's a necessary element, I think, to a productive martial art. So everything, at least I totally concur. It's, you know, exactly how it happened, you know, and it's just an interesting road. It's an interesting journey.
Lee, what is the best or greatest lessons you have learned from Mr. Parker?
Well, you asked a similar question last time, and I've been thinking about that. Um, you know, Mr. Parker, he was like a dad to me, and he and my father both said, "We're not teaching you what to think; we're teaching you how to think." And that critical thinking is one of the things that I got from Ed Parker because I applied it to my martial art. And, you know, when people say, well, when you do a martial art, how do you apply it to life? Well, these are examples. So his ideas on having margin for error and the analytical process were things that I was able to apply when I was a pilot and I became a flight instructor. And I would find myself in somewhat tricky weather situations, and I'm thinking, well, what are my options here? What's my margin for error position? These are things that are reinforced in the aviation community, but thinking on the fly and doing on the fly are things that I got from Ed Parker, which I thought were just tremendously important lessons.
In that, with your lessons, how have you conveyed that to your students, be either through personal instruction or through your seminars?
I used Ed Parker as a model because of the way that he taught. And I'd asked him about, why do you teach the way you teach? He had the disguised repetition. He had ideas that were repetitive, but they were put in different places. And you had to make the relationship later on. And sometimes he would just leave it out there and make it difficult because he said, well, it's always better if you pull teeth to get the information. It sticks better than just having it spoon fed to you. But I said, basically I said, what's up with the stories? And
that's his humor though, his humor side.
Yes. And he said, his immediate answer to me was, Jesus taught in parables. I said, well, that's very interesting, as I really didn't have much of an idea at first about how religious of a man that he was, but it would become more clear over time. And it was his way to reach people. And I tried to do the same thing because I found it to be a very handy tool for getting the idea across, especially with the humor, because he realized that when he stepped out on the mat that a lot of people were just almost petrified because of his presence and his reputation and his abilities and so on. And we would laugh. And I know Dennis agrees with me on this. We'd be in a line and, Mr. Parker would want to volunteer. And sometimes someone would shove somebody out there and sacrifice him, or the front line would step back and leave one man standing. And that guy would get grabbed and demonstrated on, and that sort of thing. But telling those stories and using a lot of personal experience just really drives it home. And I got that from him.
Yeah, it's funny. In my early years of being around him, I would always observe, obviously I'd go to the back of the room, which wasn't always the safest place to be.
Yeah.
Then Frank would make you stand in the front. But then I found, hey, even if you're in the front, there's a good chance he's not going to pick you because he's looking at the back to see who's hiding from him. And this is just my opinion and my infancy of studying Ed Parker Kenpo karate, but observing people, 18 years old, I'm looking at saying people, their responses, since he was frustrated a bit with that, which you probably observed, both of you. If he was just going to tell a story or just explain something, then he didn't have to worry about it. But he loved interaction with people. He wanted to bring you out into it so you could understand it better through hands-on application. Okay. But most of the guys I see, and some of the senior belts, you're right, they'd come in there and they would sit there and go, I'm not going to answer because I'm going to probably say the wrong response, or maybe he doesn't know the response, which that's not going to be true, or they didn't want to be looking foolish in front of their other friends by posing a silly question. And I don't think there was ever a silly question. I think he explored it all. He never made anybody feel insignificant unless you were being really stupid. Then he would, and like you and I'm talking about, like, oh, that won't work. Don't challenge him on stuff like that. That was like that I learned after the first day. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd seen him thump people because they were just being stupid. They were pushing a point. And he got irritated once in a while when somebody would explain how the technique works to him. And he's like, that aggravated him. So you'd see him zap somebody every once in a while, but You know, talking about being in a class, he used to do this class on Thursday night before the international, because you'd have people in from all over. You know, you'd have the guys coming in from Europe and so on. And it was one of those Thursday night classes. Frank was the senior student. I was next in line. And Mr. Parker was teaching a leaping crane.
Okay.
And he needed somebody to demo on. He had Frank come up, and so he works the technique on him. And when Frank is moving back to the line, Mr. Parker was speaking, and he turns and he's talking about the technique. Well, Frank moonwalked back to his spot, and that made people laugh. And of course, that caught Mr. Parker's attention. So it was he turned around and he had Frank come back, and he worked the extension on him, but he shot a side kick past his head, so that he caught him with the back of his leg, right in the back of his head, and knocked him unconscious. I saw Frank started to pitch forward onto the mat toward me, and he went down. I saw his eyes roll up in his head. He hit the ground, and you know, there's that unusual phenomenon where somebody hits the ground and it wakes them up as they hit the ground. And he's like, bang, and Frank had hit the ground. He kind of bounced up, and he pulled his legs underneath himself, and he walked back to me. And I said, Frank, you were out. He says, yeah, I know.
There's a few of those scenes you can see in some of the videos with Mr. Parker, you know, where he's traveling abroad.
But there was no more fooling around in class.
No, not with him. Nothing to undermine his credibility or to make him look, you know, less than who he was. He wanted to do it. Self-deprivation is one thing. Incidental is not. Dennis, you got any thoughts on that?
That's why I never learned to moonwalk.
So we're on that. So let's get into some of the strengths of Lee. You're known for your expertise and you as an author of writing books regarding the forms. And many times we've discussed in these Zoom meetings, the other forms. We went through one through three with Richard Planis. Let's discuss forms 5 and 6. Why should we learn these forms?
Well, you know, forms are an interesting subject. I've written an awful lot on them. One of my first, my first article published in Inside Kung Fu magazine back in like 1981 or 2 was on how to judge Kenpo forms. And I wrote that because I had come up on the circuit with a lot of hard stylists as judges, and in the Midwest, they really didn't understand what they were looking at. So that was my effort to get out there and say, you know, this is what we do and this is why we do it. So my subsequent articles were on a variety of subjects in the magazines, but that's what led to me being an author of the books. And those articles were going to be consolidated into a book that Unique Publications was going to write. And that's where I had gotten Mr. Parker to write an intro. The one that came up was printed in 2000, was many, many years afterwards, but he was still alive, and that was the reason why he wrote that for me. So we go forward on the forms. I thought, well, let's write this down, because it seemed like there really wasn't much information out there. I mean, Ed Parker's books were available, but as far as information on the forms, there wasn't a whole lot. And he had used me as the model in volume 5 of Infinite Insights. And I'm guessing because I had been a national competitor, made the national top 10, and I was reasonably good at representing what he wanted to represent. So we compile the information on forms. Almost everybody does forms, and the basic ideas are the same, which is to catalog information and act kind of like shadow boxing, which is categorized and listed and so on. But 5 and 6, if you look at the Ed Parker logic that he puts down first in the ones and carries through all the way up to 4, 5 and 6 make perfect sense. And when you mentioned earlier about people asking questions and maybe stupid questions, I wasn't afraid to ask him questions, and some of them I think were stupid questions. Others were questions that as soon as I asked them, I realized I already knew the answer. But I said, you know, so Form 5 is a collection of odd techniques. And he looked at me and went, yeah. Because I really didn't understand, but I was not afraid to make myself look stupid by asking the question, say, okay, so why am I doing this? So when he developed 5, 4 would have been the apex. People said if you understood 4, you understood the system, and it was basically the end of the line. But he was always thinking, so 5 was like, well, I want you to think about these ways to do takedowns. You can take out the bottom, take out the top, take them both out at the same time. You can take them down by striking them down, which is what the last technique in the form does. And he does some interesting categorization of the use of the parries when you do backbreaker as related to destructive fans, beginning of the technique, closing the center lines and so on. And, you know, one of the interesting things I thought was that I learned from Huck was that destructive fans was protecting fans turned sideways. The man comes in deep on the center line. So you work through that. So that's got a lot of very interesting ideas in it. And then you go to 6, and 6 is the closest thing in timing that we have to something like Tai Chi, because it's a continuous flow. And he told us that. He said, once you start moving, you don't stop. You go all the way through the form. Everything else has got breaks in it here and there. So working with the flow and working with the figure eights and so on was very interesting. And the collecting of the weapon techniques or weapon defenses. And then you would have to take that logic and move it forward. He said, well, if you were going to do a 7, and depending on which 7 you're talking about, it's like, well, 6 took the weapon away from the man. Now 7 puts the weapon in your hand. So it was that flip flop of the idea to move forward, and probably the reason why we don't have a gun form.
If you're looking at the form, the end of Form 5, I have always seen the closure of the scholar and the word come together from the right side. Why have I seen sometimes somebody coming from the left side and bringing it over there? Now, some people explain to me it's supposed to be the balance, opposites, and such. Is that correct? Can you answer that question for us?
You know, your salute is always supposed to come from the right side. That's one thing you don't need to do on the left. And something in the Kenpo system where you say, well, there's an opposite and reverse for every move, concept, principle, and definition. That's highly important. But there are things that, as you know from your experience in law, there are overt and covert actions. Okay, you can be charged with a crime by not doing something, such as failure to pay your taxes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same thing. It's like, it's there. It's just, okay, if you can do this on the right, well, yes, you could do it on the left, but when you do it on the left, it starts to get into this whole renegade system thing in the Chinese styles. And that's not us. So you do the triangle on the opposite side because you're matching footwork, and then you pick up the upside in 6, but the salute is always done from the right.
Always, correct?
Always.
Okay, I think you're right. I think that just deviated because somebody wanted to make it theirs. What is your thoughts on that, Dennis Conatser?
Well, I always come from the right side. And I was talking to Mr. Parker one day, and we were talking about this, and he goes, you do it this way: after you signify to the left, then you signal on the right, and then you're on the right, then you come up and you go out. You're already there. Why would you want to come back across your body, start with the right side, then go to the left side, then have to come back across your body and go out? So it's always coming out on the right side. The ultimate is coming out on the right side. It's where you start that people are changing sides. One is there's several possibilities here. One is that they just never learned it correctly. Two is because Mr. Parker, it was fabled that in the early days, he didn't like anybody filming anything originally. And Al Tracy was really bad for that. Al Tracy has an archive of stuff I'd love to see. He's got 8mm things of back when they had to wind up 8mm cameras. You had to wind them up. You know, there wasn't any kind of electric battery thing going on at that time, and so he didn't want things duplicated. Or sometimes he would teach somebody something specifically, and this is what it's fabled. I don't have any proof of this, but he would teach them to see where they learned it from. If he did it such and such a way, he would do that. Right, Lee?
That's absolutely correct.
And so that's another possibility. The other possibility, if they, in book 5, there's a thing where Lee goes on the left side, and I say Lee because he was the model for the penned figures. That's actually Lee in there that were in photos, but they wrote them. Edmund drew them out, and you go on the right side, then they go on the left side, and that's incorrect. Now that was because, and I got this direct from Edmund Jr. Back then it was cut and paste. Everything was cut and paste on the platforms. There wasn't any electronic anything. And when they went down to the printers, to Gonzalez's, somehow those images fell off, or the paste was not good, and he just put them back on because they looked the same to the naked eye. You know, to somebody that's not really paying attention, and so they're put on wrong. So they're actually incorrect in book 5. But people have learned it out of book 5. It's in book 5. This is Ed Parker put it out. This must be the way it is. So those are possibilities.
That reminds me of the old childhood, game of 5 of us are sitting in a circle, and I whisper something to Lee, and Lee whispers it to next. And by the time he comes back to, I don't know what you're talking about. That's not what I said. And that's, misinformation. And then as we went back, why do people don't really give the credit or reference Mr. Parker? Is because it just undermines their credibility and their ascension. God, what a word, ascension into a position of power or leadership. And so these educational videos that we do here is to flush out that and hopefully bring us back to where Mr. Parker was. Now, it's been brought up a few times that Mr. Parker promoted the idea of change. Change. Lee, what did he mean by change?
Well, that's open to interpretation, of course. But, in fact, I was watching a video of him teaching at my school today. He said, look, you want one way as your ideal. And he talked about that. There's the ideal, the what if, and the formulation phases. So when he talked about changes, like it was okay to change, but some people get so innovative that they innovate themselves right out of the system. They're not using our principles anymore, or his concepts and so on. So when you're talking about change, it's like, it's okay to change the technique, because he was the first one to tell you 10 of my black belts do the same technique and there'd be 10 different ways. And that's okay, as long as you're applying the principles.
And what's that principle, Dennis, that we love to quote a lot?
Variable expansion is obviously one of those things that I'm sure you're talking about. And variable expansion is blistered off of the 3 points of view and the more importantly, the equation formula. So he created the equation formula. Originally, it was just the rearrangement concept. Rearrangement concept morphed into the more elaborate equation formula, which case you could rearrange anything. You could prefix it, suffix it, insert, delete, adjust, alter, regulate. I mean, it just morphed into thousands of variations. And Mr. Parker used to use the story of what's 1 and 1, 2, what's 3 minus 1, two. And so you get numerous ways to get to the same result, but you could get there by using different roads. And I think you wanted people to realize that different body styles, different people, certain things, what way, and he came up with another one, what works good for one may not work good for another. So you've got to be able to tailor the art to the individual, not the reverse. Don't try to tailor the individual to the art per se, because each one of us is slightly different with our own persnickety ways to do things.
I think the thing is he's making you think. He says, okay, if you try to do a textbook, you might not have the same abilities or tools that I do, because say, Dennis, you're 6'2.5", almost 3. Lee, how tall are you, sir?
I'm 5'8" last time I checked.
Okay, so 5'8". So quick and agile versus brute size. But does the power still be applicable between the two men? Absolutely, because you know the principles. And me, who's laying on the ground after getting knocked out by both of you, is looking up and say, I don't care. Both these guys, it hurts. So the point we're talking about here, I think change should be explained this way. It's very simple. Change means to grow, to evolve. That's it. What I was when I was 18 versus now, I'm looking at that, I'm going, okay, how have I evolved? Refinement, evolution. Do I do things differently? Sure. I think I'm through them a little more now. And I'm not so energetic or enthusiastic to just jump in there and foolishly get my butt beat up. I think about it. So I think these are the factors what I'm trying to bring up that we talk about, and it's beautiful. One of the biggest problems I see with the use of the word change is sometimes people take that as mean to eliminate, to remove, to discard. No, that's what those words are for. That is not change. We're seeing that presently in our culture right now, the cancel culture. We don't agree with that. We're going to eliminate. You don't exist. If you don't go with us, we remove you. That's the mindset, primitive thinking, not a creative thinking person. And that's important. That's why I want to go back. So we're going into the forms and we're looking at form 5. I think, and this is where I'm going to run with you on this, Lee. I think it was a testimony or reflection by Ed Parker to the original concepts of his teachings, his learning, his education in Hawaii regarding Kenpo Jiu-Jitsu. Kenpo Jiu-Jitsu. You want to talk about that?
There's a lot to be said for that, because I may have mentioned in the last interview that I had taught with at a Johnson Rue gathering several years ago, and they do the sleeper technique, and it's very, very similar to the way we do the sleeper technique. So now it's like, did they get it from us? Did we get it from them? You know, but they slip in some extra. Well, I'm not going to say extra. They insert in that technique, and I caught that. And I said, "Oh, that's pretty interesting. How you're doing that." But the stand-up grappling that's in there, and the counters. I mean, that actually starts way back in short 3, because you should be looking at these techniques against grabs and say, now, if a guy grabs me in a bear hug, I do this. What happens if he does that? And you start to change these grappling sequences, chain them together, and you pick up this idea again, because 5 has a lot of these things that are for dead attacks. Like you're doing falling falcon in the sleeper. Sleeper's not a dead attack, but you're working, one's on the inside of the arm, one's working on the outside of the arm. So it's two different ways to get to the same position. So yes, I think you're right when it comes to that. And you have to do the levering correctly to make it work, which is something that's quite different in karate versus judo and grappling type arts. You have to make those work. And in striking arts, it's like, well, if I hit you like this, you'd react like that. You got to talk them into it. Either that, you got to hit them real hard, and you run out of workout partners pretty quickly.
I want to address something real quick that you brought up, a term that a lot of people are probably not familiar with. I am, but I think we should address it. There are dead attacks, semi-live attacks, live attacks, correct?
Yes.
Okay, can you explain those for us? Because I know that some of the listeners out there have never been introduced to that, and they're maybe not aware what that means.
Well, I'm glad you asked that. It's an Ed Parker construct for teaching, dead, semi-alive, and alive, and I understand it. He said, okay, a dead attack is a grab, a semi-alive is a push, and alive is a punch, kick, or maybe a weapon. It's a good teaching construct. I don't totally agree with it. I think it needs to be put someplace else, because one thing that Huck Planis said once that I was like, yeah, that's a good point. He says, how do you know if it's a push or a heel palm? And he says, you don't know until it's over. So when Mr. Parker said, well, the semi-alive is that gray area between, I said, I understand that. It was a good way to categorize it. But as far as application, I think it needs to be expanded.
Dennis, your thoughts?
Well, getting on the web of knowledge, kind of going through the grabs, tackles, pushes, punches, kicks, hugs, holds, lock, chokes, weapons. I think those can be expanded as well. If you get grabs and tackles, well, there's an and in there, and that and suggests another category to me. And Mr. Parker said, well, a tackle is a moving grab. And I think this was early Ed Parker thinking. I think the latter Ed Parker thinking would have been break out a category, because now we justify the purpose for having a separate category. Whereas early thoughts were it's just a moving grab. But obviously a tackle is an active, or I could consider it, maybe Lee would agree with it, would be a live attack. And it's actually got a push quality, if you will, but it's greater than a push, even, because you're adding more force and velocity, typically, depending on the type of tackle. So yeah, there's a lot that can be expanded on those on that area, for sure.
Well, I think the key is that you're using it in a teaching setting. Let's just, let's get down to it, guys. It's a teaching scenario. You're actually helping the student to understand what Kenpo is about in a real life circumstance. You're not thinking about that. The intent is he wants to hurt you. So I like to adhere to what Chuck Sullivan said to me, Dave Hedler said to me, and Mike Stone. I know he wants to hurt me, so I'm going to be preemptive. I'm going to shove my fist into his face and see how that goes for the guy. Okay. And but we do need it. That's the beauty of American Kenpo. That's the beauty of the mindset of Mr. Parker. And through students like you two, gentlemen, we can understand that. So these concepts, these teachings are not lost. They need to be remembered, and failure to explore and discuss them results in information that's foreign to the upcoming student, right?
I think, too, we hit on a topic there. Lee said teaching. You said teaching. We all said teaching. Well, I think that's an error right there. Who's teaching the teachers to do this? If half the people don't understand what those are, how can they relay them to a next generation down? They're not making the links stronger in the chain. They're actually making them somewhat weaker. I think we need to improve on our teachers and come up with some ability to be able to pass this information around that's a little more standard than, right now, the way it is today. It's depending on who you hang with and who's your instructor. That's kind of what you're going to get. And some people don't want you to think outside the box or go outside the box. They want you to pay attention here. And Ed Parker was always one to say, hey, go listen to anybody, come back, tell me what you think.
Here's the response to that, Dennis. That's actually counterproductive to their proposing to Mr. Wedlake. Well, we have to change. We have to change. And I'm saying, what are you changing? You're not changing, you're regressing. Right, Lee?
Well, I agree with that. When you talked about change, I'm glad you said that. we took that Ed Parker construct of dead, semi-live, and live. And what I did was what I do when I teach, I said, look, let's look at the two-man techniques. To be politically correct, you'd have to say two-person techniques today. But so we got the two mans, the multiple attackers, two-person, whatever it is. And I took that and said, okay, if you go with dead, which is grabbing, you take a technique like grasping eagles. It's a grab from the front and a grab from the back. Now, if you want to say semi-live, let's do one that is for a grab from the back and a live attack from the front like Gathering of the Snakes or Baron Aran is a real good example, because you've got the hands tied up, body contact in the rear, and you got the flying attack, and then you've got live. Let's go over to live, where we're doing parting of the snakes and so on, because now you've got two attackers that have no physical contact made yet. So the dead, semi-live, and live construct, I think, works better over here with the multiple attack techniques than it does in the initial structure, which works fine for giving a guy an idea of what kind of an attack it is, but needs to be expanded.
What if, you know, I understand we're using terms for a set of motion, you know, we're actually taking attacks that are based off of singular attacks that we've had for one person attacking another person, and we're putting together. What if we were not to use the terms and the names and said, what if we do analysis of drills? I had this with Dennis the other day. We're talking about the fighting technique sequence. He liked to use it as a drill, though that there is terminology there. Do you think we're doing an injustice to ourselves, either of you gentlemen, on putting a name to a technique rather than just calling, let's do a drill where first guy, two guys are going to grab me, and then let's see what we can do out of that. And you have to be able to relate to your teachings of what you've had to deal with before for, say, a certain type of grab. Okay, then you say, well, let's have it now where, what would you do if one guy's grabbing, one guy's going to punch, or one guy is bear hugging and the other is going to push you? You know, you understand what I'm saying? You have these different scenarios of dead, semi-live, and live. And I think the difference between dead and live is the actual intention of the assailant. Is he trying to, I mean, if he's going to punch you, you know he's going to punch you because he's going to lift a hand. If he's just pushing you, it's not as aggressive, but it is aggressive because he's trying to hurt you or intimidate you. What are your thoughts, gentlemen? Either one.
I subscribe to having the names on the techniques because Mr. Parker told me that he named them because he wanted it to bring out a mental image. And they do this in other systems. If you talk to people in the Kung Fu systems, the Tai Chi people, you've got White Crane standing on a rock, or, you know, play the guitar or something like that. It gives you a mental model to go from. And some of these things don't make sense to us, and they've got a philosophical aspect to it and so on, but I get it. And Mr. Parker said, okay, we got a name, it gives you an image, it's the ideal phase. Now you're supposed to go and tear that technique apart and do the what ifs and look for the relationships with other techniques and so on. And then you do that expansion, like you said, with, well, what if they do this and what if they do that? And that's where you get into your formulation. So I think that all fits together. The names go away with the training. So you just need something, because it's difficult to say, well, do orange belt technique number 1 for a hair grab. It's just easier to say, do clutching feathers.
I understand that. I'm talking about later when we start combining, you know, tech. Why not use the same terms that we did to identify a technique in the lower belt you did, and just say, put this one together and, you know, this technique together, and, you know, you've got, you know, you have somebody trying to do a triggered salute and the other guy is coming behind and, you know, crashing wings. Okay, you got the guy by the bear hug and the other guy's going to push. You know, you know what I'm saying? Why not reinforce what you already have learned and how those can pick those pieces. And now we start to create a whole different scenario. Dennis, your thoughts?
Well, I think, the thing is, if you do that, not always are you doing the complete technique that you originally learned. Oftentimes you're only doing a portion or maybe the initial attack. So you're actually creating a new technique, thus a new name, even though you're using certain ideas from something that was taught priorly. It's the same thing as doing right punch techniques. You teach one right punch technique, and it's for a roundhouse punch. Another one's an uppercut, another one's a thrust, jab type thing. And so each technique has a different name for a different purpose. So I think that once again, you need to, I'm with Lee, I'm also into naming them, because you're utilizing, like I said earlier, sometimes portions of the technique, not the entire technique. And so in essence, you're creating a whole new technique.
Well, isn't that the evolution of what we're trying to do? We're trying to evolve, make you think rather than change. I'm not discarding because a lot of well, I came up with green belt techniques. So I have a problem sometimes relating it to other, the breakdowns, but the 2-man attacks and such. I think of when we would be in Pasadena, and Frank sometimes like, okay, let's do bull in the ring or some people called it, multiple attacks. And he would just call out, you get 4 or 5 of us there and stick you in the middle and say, okay, now respond. And you'd have some guy come running at you to grab you. And then the other guy, then he would respond. And he broke it down where you had a single attack within a group setting. And then he would start to add multiple attackers to the situation. And this goes back to where you have to deal with this very quickly. Otherwise, you're going to be in trouble. I don't care who you are. Mike Tyson, one of the Gracie boys, Bruce Lee and his greatness of being in a movie. This is not going to work well. It's not going to end well if you don't immediately remove those confrontations in a systematic way. And so I think with the form 5, you're looking at going back to form 5, and we're dealing with dead, semi-live, and live movement, but mostly it was takedowns. And the Kenpo Jiu-Jitsu, I think it's important that understanding where we came from and not discarding that material. And I think that's what's getting lost.
I don't know. I see a lot of people that are blending what we do with the BJJ and so on, and various types of grappling systems. But, they're changing by elimination in a lot of places, I think. It's a little distressing because you see that they don't have some of the techniques that were on the original list, and it kind of takes a piece of the puzzle out. And largely, when I've talked to people, say, well, how come you didn't learn that technique? Well, my instructor didn't like it. Why didn't they like it? Well, apparently they didn't understand it, or somebody just decided not to teach it to them. He said, yeah, but this is a piece in the puzzle that fits over here. When I show them, they go, oh, yeah, I see it. So I really think.
Your thoughts?
Well, I've said this before, and I agree with Lee, that the discarding is to me the problem. I think the base system needs to remain the same. However, and I'll use it again. I kind of relate to this matter as it's like the alphabet we have. We have 26 letters of the alphabet. When's the last time it was changed? Well, not for several centuries. And the thing is, but daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, sometimes hourly, the alphabet changes or adds new words or redefines old words, like the word web. When I was a kid, web was only what a spider was all about and what he wove to entrap his food. today, most of the time it's the internet. The spider still weaves a web, and I think there could be more words in the future that are going to be like that. And I think techniques are the same way. This is, change. The internet now becoming a word, another definition of web, is a change, but it's not a discarding of the other web that's out there. And I think that's what's happening. I think that's what Lee's talking about. Is the problem is people are discarding this stuff rather than adding it to their toolbox as another tool that's in there. And you can improve a tool, but the tool doesn't go away. It just has an improved model and or an improved definition or an improved way to use the tool.
Interesting that you bring up the web. To quote Shakespeare, "Oh, what a tangled web we weave. When we practice to deceive," means that when you lie or act dishonestly, you are initiating problems.
Deception.
Isn't that what we're seeing right now in Kenpo? I think so, but that's me. I'm objective. I've been listening to, I've had over 200 videos now. I've had the great privilege to spend quality time with you gentlemen and to learn from you. And we're just discussing, and this, I can't see why we wouldn't want to revisit all these teachings, because we don't have Ed Parker anymore, but we do have Lee Wedlake, and we have Dennis Conatser, who trained with him the last 12 years of his life. Lord, it is foolish for us to discard the opportunity to spend with gentlemen like you and to remember why we studied American Kenpo, not John Doe's Kenpo or Joe Blow's Kenpo or Jane Doe or whoever person Kenpo, because Kenpo is a very large umbrella. And under it, there's different facets, but the most complete umbrella is American Kenpo. And because of that, it is offset and set off in different directions, people to learn and to explore these things. And what an interesting concept. So going back to Form 5, which is really actually, in some ways, dealing with an extension of Form 3. Would you agree with that, Lee?
Well, they're all extensions of each one.
Right. But 3 basically deals with the first techniques, obviously the first technique form we have to deal with. But what else can we learn from that can be also applied into 5?
Just the fact that you're looking at this, it's like short 3 was all the commonality there is they're all dead attacks. And in 4, they're all live attacks, which is the reason I think that Snaking Talon was changed in application from being for a push to being for a combo punch, because it didn't quite fit in there because it went semi-live. And long 3 was considered to be the semi-live form.
Mm-hmm.
Then when you get past 4 and into 5 is like, well, you've got things flying at you, you've got people grabbing you, you've got people trying to hit you with clubs. And it's this second time you go down to your knees, kind of like the Hawaiian Kenpo that you did back and forth with bowing to Buddha. Now you're going to pick that up again when you get into the end of circling horizon. So it's all very interesting in the pickup of the concepts that run all the way through and threads of thought.
I do like the idea. I'm gonna tell you, if you want to work out, do 5 with those deep bows. We don't do that. Is that a big problem, Dennis? We see today with the stances, and you think about it in our forms, they seem to be obliviated.
Fundamentals are imperative, and of course, one of our basic fundamentals, most important fundamentals, is stance, and the most important is maneuvering. Mr. Parker said oftentimes before you can do anything else, you've got to maneuver into position. And once you maneuver into position, then you got to stabilize your base. You got to have a good base to work from. Otherwise, you're oftentimes much weaker. So stance and foot maneuvers are 2 primary things that are essential to being successful. And I think, like you say, a lot of it today, if you look at competition, a lot of the stances are either weak or non-existent. And the people that win usually have extraordinary, or they put a lot of work into their stances and maneuvering. You know, and the hand gestures just follow along, and the kicking gestures follow along. So I think that's a major part.
I think if you go back, there's a beautiful section in Lee's book, The General Rules of Motion. If you're going to do anything, at least read that, please, once, then put it down, think about it, and reread it, and put it down, and then write it out. And boy, I'll tell you right now, we don't have any, you know, what they would call compliance. We don't have, you know, it's like if you worked at General Motors and they had a factory in Detroit, and say they had someone around the country. I'm just going to say hypothetically, there is some kind of conformity where the compliance of all of the products, which when they originally were created and thought out, and that was when Mr. Parker did that, and he shared it with Lee, and he shared it with Dennis and any other of his seniors, and you guys would go around the country, and then you would find you were back into the childhood game of, and by the time it got back to you, what are you talking about? That's not exactly at all what I said. And that's what we're having a problem with. I understand why a lot of people think Mr. Parker's stance has changed toward the end of his life, but that was a physical ailment, not from a, you know, from a personal choice. He was standing because he had bad legs, bad joints. You know, people don't realize he was fighting that all the time. And now we see people just standing up like a teepee. I don't know what that is, but that's not what I was taught. And I think Form 5 really reinforces to go back to making sure you're in those correct stances.
I think it helps. It's a reiteration of principle that starts way back in short one.
And what's that principle, sir?
Of solidify your base. I mean, your very first move, step back, drop in your stance, establish your base. And you learn how to connect your upper body with your lower body. And that is a theme throughout. You've got to have that. And the Chinese have an interesting saying that I agree with, which is when you have a problem with the hands, you have to look at the feet. You've got to have that solid base. And whether there's a lot of different theories on it across the different systems, but a lot of us just drop down in that horse stance, neutral bow, or something like it, because you've got to anchor yourself.
We get back to the question I posed earlier about Kenpo Jiu-Jitsu. We never abandoned that, correct?
No.
Never.
So why is it not being discussed or taught?
Well, like I said before, I think teaching has been an issue, and the quality of teaching and the training of teachers has been a problem. And of course, without that, there's no a standard compliance, you know, because the art has evolved so rapidly that one thing that didn't evolve was sometimes the passing on of information. Ed Parker came up in an era where we didn't have the technology we have today. Had he lived even another 10 years into his life, he would have had the internet. The internet started basically after he had already passed away. It really started hitting big through the early 90s. And had he been alive for 30 years, had he been alive today, he would have been, 90 years old a couple of days ago or so.
Mm-hmm.
And had that happened, I think we would have a much more compliant system today. And I think he would be able to explain more what change, what he really meant with change. And change to him always and never was to delete anything. He had files full of material that was, he said, I don't want to delete anything. I want to maintain it. I'm just going to file it. So he kept files of stuff, even though it wasn't relevant to maybe his new ideas. He still had some of his earliest discoveries and his earliest attitudes towards something. But once he found something better, He didn't throw it away. He filed it so he would recognize where he came from and what the purpose was, that he didn't want to continue that.
Lee, I got a question for you. Can we apply the jujitsu techniques and change that around so that instead of mutilating somebody, maybe it doesn't require us to mutilate them, maybe make them comply with us? Say you as a law enforcement agent, because that would be probably the time that that would come into play.
Well, it's one of the things that we teach is the force progression. I teach this in my Kenpo as well, because we have to use it out there on the street. It's like somebody doesn't want to show you their driver's license, you can't stick your handgun in their ear. You know, you've jumped a couple of notches on the force progression. We've got these techniques in the system, and these are the ones that I see that have disappeared because people don't seem to understand them. Or as I go out and teach, say, oh, you want to do that like this, and you get what Ed Parker called the slanted forehead, because like, oh, that's how that goes. You've got so many contact manipulation techniques in our system that are used for exactly those sort of things. And when you take a brand new student and you're working with these techniques, like either call it the pincher or the grasp of death or crossing talon or something, say, you take this arm and you put an arm bar on it. If you increase the force, you sprain it or you can break it. In a lot of our techniques, you break that arm and then you twist it around a little bit and you aggravate the injury. But we've got all these manipulation techniques that can be substituted, and it's our job as instructors to say, look, you don't have to break his arm. You can manipulate it, and you can take crossing talon and turn it into an entangled wing, or you can do this handshake technique and convert it to that handshake technique, and let the guys and the girls work with that so they understand there's a moral, ethical, and legal consideration to every single technique that you would do on the street. And you have to be situational aware. You have to be trained well enough that you go, I can't just unload 5 swords on this guy and poke out his eyeballs and break his neck with a hand sword. I can't do that. But some of these techniques that we teach, where you're hitting the person in the chin and turning their neck, is like, you don't have to break their neck, but you can crank them and keep them from hitting you back. That's the sort of thing I think that needs to be emphasized. You
do that in law enforcement training, I can tell that, because one, forget the moral aspect, it's a legal reason. Right. Everybody's suing, you know, every city, you know, county and whatnot for law enforcement actions. That's why we're having this big pushback right now on defunding the police. Right. No, I actually think you should increase the funding to educate them so that they'll understand when they're confronted that as you said, it becomes forced aggression. It starts to change, and where you need to, I mean, you always have at your disposal lethal with your sidearm. Okay, we know that, but you don't go there until you need to have, and then when you go there, there's no hesitation. Otherwise, you end up dead.
Right.
I mean, that's about it. But here's a question: what do you deal with the student in the school? And the student is not an adult, but is a 12-year-old child. You're going to teach them how to gouge out an eye or, you know, break a neck. How do you change that around so that they can still be able to deal with the circumstances of bullies in school?
Well, many years ago, when I was teaching, we taught the kids the same curriculum that we taught the adults. And as children started to come into the schools, because, you know, that, 8 to 12-year-old group was not very large in the schools back in the 70s. And it started to increase. And by the time you hit the 80s, it's like most schools had gone to more than 50% of a youth population. And the instructors didn't always change with that. Or they actually went and said, we're not even going to teach those self-defense techniques. We're going to teach some things that make them feel good. And we do these, what they call universal forms and so on. And they've got value, yes. But as far as teaching the self-defense, way back in the early 80s, we started taking out the things like the eye pokes and the arm breaks. We would teach self-defense techniques that had maybe 2 moves instead of 5 or 6 moves. We wouldn't teach striking serpent's head with a half fist to the throat. We would teach it with a heel palm. So, you know, obscure sword is done with maybe a hammer fist into the sternum and not a chop to the throat. So we took Ed Parker's principles that you can alter and you can regulate and so on, and we just made that for kids. The flip side of that was when these kids got older and went into the adult program, we had to backfill and say, you learn the children's version, but this is not uncommon. You'll hear karate historians say that a lot of the forms that are done, the pinyans and the heians and all that, those are children's forms that we're talking. Shikichin Funakoshi was a school teacher, and they used it as physical education. And this is what was taught to a lot of American servicemen who brought it back with them. And so some of the traditionalists would say, yeah, these guys got kids karate. We had, Dennis, you're laughing because you've heard that before. Particularly down there in Arizona. But yeah, we changed the techniques for the kids because we just said, you know, I wouldn't give a child the keys to my car. I'm not going to give them the ability to poke somebody in the eyes.
I see. Dennis, you have a thought on that?
No, I agree. Once again, it goes back to the teaching flow. You go to college, you have grade school up to 8th grade, then you have 4 years of college or 4 years of high school, then you have college. You have to have a college degree to teach kindergartners. And we have nothing like that. And that's the breakdown. We don't have the educational process that actually is certifiable up through to where we get a black belt. As a black belt doesn't mean you're a badass or anything like that, which a lot of people think that's what it is. What it means is that you're a junior instructor. The black belt means you're starting in the instruction road. That supposedly is our college type era. But we need a lot of work to do with that. We need a lot of standardization to teach these principles that we don't want to just hope that they're picked up. We want them, they need to be picked up and to be taught on a regular basis and certified. And that's today, certification basically varies from one to the other. It's not really a central place. Ed Parker certified Ed Parker people, but he certified a lot of his students people, and a lot of them, even them, still were missing certain elements because he didn't have time, because the art grew so much and it evolved so rapidly through the years that there wasn't a podium like we have here to be able to pass down information. Ed Parker would have a weekly, I have no doubt he'd have a weekly show talking about something every week, or he'd have over 1,000 videos right now over something that every week you could turn into, or you can go to his YouTube channel and you could pull up information on long 5 or the 6 or basics or footwork or strikes or whatever. And unfortunately he didn't have that, so I guess we need to do that. The one thing he did do was he taught us the basis to our system was logic and how to think. And when you do logic, you have to think. And we've got a great base that he left us. We just have to expand it and clarify it.
Let's move off of that now, and let's go to Form 6. You have a background in Tai Chi, correct?
I do.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Explain that so that the people listening will understand what that means.
There's a significant difference in that Chinese art. That the general division there is you have the Tai Chi or Tai Chi, depending on which dialect you like to use. And that usually refers to the health and fitness side. And then you have the Tai Chi Chuan. Chuan means fist. And so when somebody's teaching you Tai Chi Chuan, you're learning the fist applications. In other words, you're learning the bunkai, or you're learning how to apply the movements. But Tai Chi is misunderstood and maligned because it's done in slow motion. And karate people like to make fun of that, and I don't know why. I came to not understand why, because years ago I was way back and say, I don't get it. But if you think about it, when you learn Kenpo, you do it in slow motion too. You just don't always do it in slow motion. So you have to understand the reason for the slow motion is that it is to get the practitioner to feel everything in their body and correct, realign, confirm, body scan, whatever you want to call it, so that you got the right body mechanics as per that particular method of motion. And in Kenpo, you're supposed to do the same sort of thing. It's just that we speed it up. So in Tai Chi, there's more emphasis on the slow motion movement, so you can feel the proper body mechanics, so you can work on the breathing. And it gets to be much more meditative. Whereas in Kenpo, we have a tendency, like most people say, well, the forms are they're just there. You have to learn them to get a belt, because you really want to go out and start beating people up with the techniques. And this is all a package, and Ed Parker put it together. He said, there's 5 aspects to it: basics, forms, self-defense, sparring, and street freestyle. So you put all those guys together, and the Tai Chi people have a tendency to stick more with, let's just do the form, let's work on the breathing, let's work on the meditation, more so than a lot of the karate people do. So they use a lot of the same principles. I heard a well-known instructor once say that we are the only people who do X. And I thought, well, that's an ignorant statement, because other systems do that as well. They have different terminology. We have tailoring. Tai Chi people call it the body ruler. They use your own body to set the width and depth and height of your stances, just like we do, just a different term. So saying that we're the only people that do something is pretty ignorant and maybe arrogant.
No question there. It's funny you're saying this. I'm going to go back to what you used. You just made a mention, and Dennis and I have talked about this, but we never really brought it up. And I believe it's in Mr. Parker's Infinite Insights, and I'm not sure if it's volume 3, but he definitely talked about it here in Kenpo Karate from 1960. And I'm going to reference this right now. It's real quick. It's real simple. The section is on page 22, and it's called breathing. Breathing. Proper breathing for maximum efficiency does not only pertain to Kenpo Karate, etc., etc., etc. And that is from one of his first treatises. So why are we ignoring that, in our Kenpo training there, Dennis?
I think it's one oversight of many. Breathing's probably one of the least talked about principles that we have. We all do it. I mean, try doing the 4 on one breath. It's not going to happen.
Wait a second. Have you been into a tournament lately? Lee will tell you about that. I know that. I mean, boy, oh boy, I watch the speed. It starts off at they're razor fast, and all of a sudden they're just barely climbing over the finish line with their tempo. So go ahead, Dennis. I'm sorry to be rude like that, but I just
no. Yeah, the
get what I'm
cardio thing
talking about.
No, absolutely. Breathing is. I mean, it's one of the. It's a bodily function that we have to have. I mean, there's no ifs, ands, or buts, and we need to not only learn to breathe, but we got to learn how to regulate breathing, how to be able to control breathing. That's another issue, and it's hardly ever worked on or talked about. Now in Tai Chi, as an example, which I've done, I don't really profess to teach it, used to at one point, but you have to breathe. It's taught you how to breathe. You have to inhale here, exhale here, in through the nose, out through the mouth, and it's a steady breathing. Even though things are done slow, you still have to breathe while you're going through these motions. And so it's different. We tend to do things, I think, today very fast. Everybody's rapido. Everything's going to be done extremely fast, and consequently, some of these extremely important principles, I think, are overlooked, which is why you do 5 or 6 fast moves. Next thing you know, you're out of breath because you didn't learn how to pace. You didn't learn how to breathe while you're going. So in essence, you just didn't learn how to breathe properly.
Let's go to Form 6, the so-called defense of weapons form. You say it is the continuous motion form, correct?
Yes.
Why do we see it broken up then?
I'm going to go with Dennis's answer. It's like, the instruction maybe wasn't so good because Mr. Parker told us is once your hands start moving, they keep moving. You don't stop. So as far as an explanation for seeing it broken up, I'd have to go back to the quality of the instruction. The same reason that we don't see very good stances a lot of times. I think part of this is cultural influence because people want to get things fast and maybe they get pushed along a little too quickly. So when I see 5th and 6th degree black belts that can't do an attention stance, I have to wonder why. And I think it's that quality of instruction.
Do you think we're more interested in the fast food approach? The quick satisfaction, let's do it. We look good in a tournament maybe, and we need to change it up for that?
I do. That's always been an issue. And that was one of the reasons that they had belt colors added, is because Americans like that. And over the years in the karate schools, we saw that just having a different color belt wasn't enough. You had to start adding stripes. And then you had to add 2 and 3 and 4 stripes. And I even met an instructor that said, I promote them every time they come in. And I said, how do you do that? He said, I have a Sharpie and I put a line on their belt for every class that they come into. And he had a huge school because people love that stuff. And everybody likes recognition. I get it. But I think it went a little too far where people were being patted on the head saying, that was a great job, even though it wasn't, and being rewarded for things that maybe they shouldn't have been rewarded for.
Funny you're saying that. We do that every day. We pick up a phone. We got our phone. Hey, how you doing? Selfie time. Here. I mean, we document billions of photographs every day around this world about, it's like, oh, do I look good? Do my clothes? It's like this, the ego is being addressed on that. So in a forms division though, if here's the issue that I remember when I came and I was with Frank, he reworked my Form 4 to be like his Form 4. And he said, you have to do this, Pablo, if you want to compete and win in the tournaments. I said, well, in the Kenpo division, they're going to see it. And I'm in Pasadena and I have you coming in and others, and we're doing the traditional Form 4 as Planis would teach it and such. But Trejo said, no, you have to add some showmanship to it. Showmanship. And he would, when he would do first the opening, with everything. I mean, they're like with their dramatic pauses and he was like, you even use a photograph of him from Form, boom, but he's doing this carrying the baby with the over exaggerating the forward bow, and he beat that into my head. I actually can do Form 4 at least 2 different ways, the original and then Trejo version. Okay. And there is a difference. There is a big difference. There is a difference. And I make sure that I keep all my fingers together, Mr. Wedlake. No fingers, like whatever, what you see, and the other factor I always see people doing, and I'll go to Dennis on this in a second, is that they're really good on their right side with their kicks and their strikes. But when they go to their left side, if that kick is supposed to be right at the, knee, the left side they'll be kicking the ankle. They never even get it up there. Their basics are so not uniform.
Yes.
So Dennis, your thoughts, go ahead.
No, that's true. I was just saying, you know, the fingers, you see a sword hand and the fingers are like this, and they don't realize they're gonna tuk, 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 they're gonna lose power, you know, by each one collapsing on each other instead of putting all the power in the palm and you know, going that way. You know, it's just again, I think just quality instruction, and I think that's the simple answer, and I think it's the elaborate answer at the same time. Our quality instruction is, I think, a key thing. And I said the same thing as Lee. You know, you go there and you call the class to attention, and some have their feet together, some have them they're a foot apart, some are pointing outwards like ducks. They're you know, across the board, and they need to look at, you know, book two, and book two has the stance in there. If they would just look at Mr. Parker's treasury of, you know, a glossary of moves through the system, he addressed everything. He just didn't address everything in the Infinite Insights in great detail. And of course, that's where these kind of chats come in, where we can at least discuss some of these things and maybe direct people to, you know, investigate some of these books that are out there, and you know, look for, you know, more information on these things.
And Lee, as you address Form 6, you break it down beautifully into the different weapons attacks, which you have here, the, you know, the knife attacks, club attacks, gun, and then you do the isolation. Dennis brought it to my attention. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's only five knife attacks. Why is that?
Gun attacks.
No, I'm looking at knife.
Okay.
I'm looking right here. I'm
Well,
going
you're
right
talking
down
about you're talking about in the form. Okay.
in the form. Are they sufficient? Are they realistic? Are they just pretty?
Well, I don't think Ed Parker put things together just to be pretty. He always had good logic for this. And when you talk with him about the construction of the techniques, and what I tell people when I teach them short three, I said, you have to look for the relationship of the techniques, because if you said, why did he pick this technique for that attack? And sometimes we have 2, 3, 4, 5, or even 6 or more defenses against that same situation. Why did he pick that one? And when you start to look for the connections, you'll see why he did that. There is definitely a logic to these things about which leg is forward, how the attack is coming in, the interchangeability of techniques. For a knife technique can be used for a gun and vice versa, and the importance of the overlapping figure eights and the open-ended triangle. So by breaking those things down and really giving some thought to which techniques are in there, that really gives you the answers.
How come, Dennis, we haven't expanded on the weapons techniques? Or do we need to just use these as a base and then evolve our own responses?
Well, weapon techniques I mean, there's 3 levels of weapons. There's clubs, knives, and guns. Clubs are, you know, the bottom of the tier. Knives are second, and guns, of course, are the most dangerous. Knife techniques, particularly, we have a base idea for knife techniques. Certainly not an extensive look at them. Since that form was developed, and even maybe before and during that form was developed, you've had those are particularly all thrusting type maneuvers, which are the easiest to defend against. They're still dangerous, but they're the easiest compared to, say, the sewing machine knife attack or the slashing knife attack, which we don't address in the forums that much at all. And so those need to definitely be expanded upon. We've got the simple ones, not the advanced.
Lee, give me your input on the knife attacks. We derive from them. What can we expand from them, and what should we avoid from them?
Well, you know, I trained a bit with Danny Inosanto. I think almost everybody knows who he is, probably one of the top martial artists on the face of the earth. And I remember he opened up a class. He said, if somebody pulled a knife on me, I'd hit him with a chair. So I said, okay, this is the top knife guy in the world, and he's saying that. I'm gonna go with that. I look at the techniques as just for their interchangeability, because the knives and the gun techniques can be used for the same things. And they've got ideas in there, like with the stand-up jiu-jitsu in some of the gun techniques and so on. But as far as developing, you know, this is like a big corporation. We've got sales out there. We've got the karate schools that sell it. And then you've got the marketing part. And then you've got research and development. And that's what we're supposed to be. We're supposed to do research and development. I taught this at a seminar in Las Vegas years and years ago. Because there's people out there that say, nobody shoots a gun, nobody holds a gun in one hand. Well, we know that they do. Go on YouTube and look at police shootings out there. You'll see a lot of people do it with one hand. This person was insistent that everybody does it with two hands. It's like, well, you do need to practice gun defenses against that two-handed attack. You also need to practice what they do if it's upside down in what they might call the thug grip. And I have my guys do that. They develop techniques for this sort of thing. The knife techniques give you a good entry to figuring out what happens. And this wasn't taught. This is something that Mr. Parker threw out at us. And he mentioned it over and over. He said, open end triangle, open end triangle. And until I started working in the Philippine arts, I didn't realize how important that was, because they teach what to do when they feel the intercept and they change the line of attack, and how you have to flow with that with an open-ended triangle. And our knife techniques, in particular, there's one that almost everybody says they hate it. It's piercing a lance, because you do the pickup and you spin around. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, I would never spin around. It's like, well, I don't think I would either, coming off cold. But once you're working in combination attacks where there's a lot of what they call pressurizing, it may force you to have to turn. And so when you work flow drills, these knife techniques, you go, that's where that comes in. Okay. The pieces all start to fit together.
Did you find that flow theory from Inosanto?
I got it from, well, I studied with a man named Al McLucky, who's Mr. Parker said he's exceptional. He's a friend of mine out in the Midwest, known him since 1980 or so. I trained with a grandmaster in Petit Tertia named Leo Gahi. That was some very informative time that I spent with him and his guys. And I also worked with Danny.
Okay. What are the problems in Form 6 that we have there that are really cleared up in the application of the real life attempt? You know, you can look at the first technique off the bat, but.
Well, yeah, you take some of these techniques and you say, well, I don't know if I would do that. I think instead of checking, you know, or the position check or even a pressing check, I might do a grab. Yeah, you probably would, because that's what people want to do.
Right.
When a sharp, shiny object comes at your crotch or something, you're going to want to grab it. And you need to understand these things. You've got to understand Ed Parker's, you know, ideas behind this, which is divert, seize, control, disarm, and the fact that they can be used almost in any combination. You got to have divert.
Sure.
But seize and control, it can be two different things. And disarm comes in two flavors. Either you take it away or you hit him hard enough, he drops it on his own. Okay. So you work through these knife techniques, and it's learning those variations on those things that is so important, because, you know, you've got the ideal phase techniques give you some good ammo to work with, but then you've got to run with it and see where the variations are, and understand that when he put some of these techniques into forms, like entwined lance, that's a damn difficult technique to do on somebody. but you've got to look at the ideas, like, why did he do it like that? Say, okay, I get it. I see where he's showing an opposite and or reverse. He's giving us a concept that he presented in 4, and we're picking it up in 6. And we're taking calming the storm and we're compounding it.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the ideas that we're getting in there. So as a standalone knife technique, maybe not so good, but for encapsulating principle and concept, good stuff.
You brought up an observation where you see some people perform, say, form 6, and they're doing the first technique, glancing lance. Some step back to the other step off to 730. Why? What's it matter? What's it matter?
You know, it really doesn't. If that's the way they want to do it, that's fine. But I believe that change was done because people were trying to do the technique for the wrong attack. So they've changed the attack to make the technique work. And my thinking on that is, when I've seen people do it, the attacker steps in with the right straight thrust, but turns their body totally sideways, which in essence, now the man with the knife can't use his rear hand. And one of the basic Philippine concepts is, if you got a knife in one hand, you're going to have a knife in the other.
Sure.
Okay. And if he's got a knife, you should get a sword. If he gets a sword, you get 2 swords. It's that thinking. Mm-hmm. So somebody who knows how to use a knife would not turn completely sideways and cut off the rear hand. Just like they wouldn't throw a step through punch and turn completely sideways, because now they can't fire the follow-up. Being that somebody steps in completely sideways, now you can't get a front kick into the groin. So what do? You have them step in with the other foot. So now the groin is available. Now you can make the technique work, and it works even better if you go back on a 45. The problem I see is, like, now for you to get the second part with the leap off, you got to leap even farther so you can get the proper angle incidence with the side kick. Mm-hmm. And when Ed Parker and I discussed this technique, I remember it vividly, because you whacked me upside the head with that middle knuckle strike in the mastoid process. Mm-hmm. And he had told me, he says, this is 2 techniques put together. First half is for one, the second half is when your hands are in a different point of origins. I get it.
That's what Huck Planis said too to me. He said that this is actually 2 techniques that you're dealing with, and obviously the second was leaping crane, which you brought that up. But I find it interesting. But in the application in tournament competition, it should be marked down or not if the person does not step back directly to 6, or should he be stepping off?
I wouldn't penalize somebody for that. It's like, I don't agree with it, but if he or she's doing it, they do it well. Okay, I get it. I know why they're doing it, so I'm not going to mark them off.
I see. Okay, so would that same apply when they're closing their salutation in form 5 and they go to the left side to close out?
No.
Thank you. I wanted to make sure I got that. Okay, good enough. Dennis, your thoughts? You're laughing down there, but what the heck, right? Dennis, what's your thoughts on that?
My mind's just wandering to that. Well, I was thinking too, we were talking about, the knife, being simplistic, but you know what? All those moves also could be for a right punch or an uppercut. They could be used, they're extensions. Obviously, there's a more dangerous weapon in your hand, but really the basic ideas could be, initially, the divert could be done in numerous ways. It could be an inward block or everything else. The only thing is you have to continue to watch the weapon or control, seize and eventually disarm when it's a knife. Whereas a right punch, you don't have to worry that far into the equation because you've already done that, or you got hit, one or the other. So, but a lot of those are the same type issues. They could be used for a right punch or obviously a knife. It could be either way.
Have you re-examined it to improve it, or you just leave it alone?
I'm really partial to what the Filipinos do, and I think if you've got a limited amount of time, that's what you go do, because those guys do this all the time. I mean, we're really a civilian martial art punch and kick system.
Mhm.
And you want to get into the weapon stuff, I think invest a little bit of time with the Filipinos.
Okay, so you're not discarding it, you just go into a better source for your knowledge, is what you're thinking.
Yeah, that stuff has worked really well for me in the past, and it helped get me better insights into what Mr. Parker was doing.
I think it's sad because it would be a natural, progression of going from 6 to making 7 being with the knife. But you know what? I think we should just do this. Have a knife in there, have a club here, have the gun back here, and then you got it all covered, boys. Okay.
Yeah, that's how it works, though.
Beat them, stab them, and then shoot them.
That's called a Texas Ranger.
A baton and handcuffs, a handgun.
Lord have mercy. Well, don't mess with Texas. That's all I'm going to tell you right now. I love Texas. Actually, I have family down there, so it's a great state, and I'm so happy that it's doing better now. It's like I said, there's the bottom line here is that taking time with you gentlemen is so important because it flushes out all these little, indiscrepancies. You're finding things that are not gelling, they don't fit. So it's important. Before we close out, and we've covered so much, do you have any more books coming out, Lee?
Let's just say I've got an idea for a follow-up to the compendium.
Beautiful. I hope that comes to fruition. I think it would be important. And again, if you want to get a copy of the other book that you have, go right onto Amazon, correct?
Yes, go to Amazon or go to Blue Snake Books.
Okay. And then obviously we're pushing Mr. Conatser to write, and he is going to be in the process of doing that. Right, Dennis?
Yes.
Right, Dennis?
Process.
He's gonna finally put his life into a written form. The golden dragon tells you how it is, kind of thing. So anyway, I before we close, is there anything last you want to say, Mr. Conatser? One more thing with you.
No, it's I think been a fruitful discussion. Always fun to reunite with Lee. Great insights and great camaraderie. Thank you, Paul.
Mr. Wedlake, final thoughts?
Well, it's always fun listening to Dennis. We've always had a great time when we've been together in person. But to the people that are watching this, I'd like to say, make it fun. Keep at it. It's a lifelong thing. It's like I've been doing this since I was 11 years old, and I just turned 67. And if it's boring, I'm not doing it. This has been mentally stimulating. It's been good for my body. I'm, at the age I am, I got some aches and pains, but I don't have any underlying medical conditions. I don't have to take any pills. I attribute that to martial art training, but it's been fun.
The chemistry between you two is wonderful. You can tell how playful you guys can be, and I can see in the back of your mind you're reflecting on things. Yeah, we didn't discuss it. I would like to next time just have a one-on-one with you, and hopefully bring in one of your other peers into it, and let's go back and talk about your relationship with Ed Parker and some of the things you guys did together. I think it would be fun. But until then, I want to say thank you very much for spending this morning with me. I really appreciate it. You guys are awesome. And it's nice to talk to Hall of Fame members. You guys are the gold standard. In Dennis's case, he is the gold standard.
Right?
He is gold. He's just golden. Okay. I'll leave it at that. All right. Anyway, thank you very much on behalf of the Kenpo Karate Hall of Fame. Salute.
Respects.